He didn't expect to see a table. When people talk about past life regression, they describe ancient cities, battles, love stories, but when he closed his eyes and let himself drift backward, past this life, past birth, past the moment of arrival, what he found was a room, and in that room was a table. And around that table sat the architects of his entire existence. The session started like any other. Dim lights, soft music playing in the background. The therapist's voice guiding him down, 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 into a state so relaxed that his body felt like it was melting into the chair. His breathing slowed, his thoughts quieted, and then came the instruction that changed everything. Go back before you were born. Go to the place where decisions were made. Show me what you find. At first, there was nothing. Just darkness. Not scary darkness, but the kind that feels safe, like being wrapped in a warm blanket. He floated in that darkness for what felt like forever but was probably only seconds. And then, slowly, light began to appear. Not bright, blinding light, soft light, the kind you see through closed curtains on a Sunday morning. And as the light grew stronger, shapes began to form. Walls, a ceiling, a floor. He was in a room. The room was unlike anything on earth. The walls weren't really walls. They seemed solid but also transparent, like looking through frosted glass. Beyond them, he could sense infinite space, stars, galaxies, all of existence humming with energy. But inside this room, everything was focused, concentrated, purposeful. This was a space designed for a specific task, and that task was planning. In the center of the room stood the table. It was large, circular, made of something that looked like polished stone but glowed with an inner light. The surface was smooth, almost mirror-like, and when he looked at it, he could see images moving beneath the surface, scenes playing out like watching a movie through water, and he understood, without being told, that these were possibilities, potential futures, different versions of a life that hadn't been lived yet. He wasn't alone in the room. There were others. He couldn't see them clearly at first. Just presences, energy signatures that felt familiar in a way that went beyond knowing, but as his awareness sharpened, they began to take form. Shapes that resembled human figures but were made of light, each one radiating a different color, a different frequency. And he recognized them, not their faces, because they didn't really have faces in the way we understand faces, but he recognized their essence, their souls. These were his people, his soul family. The ones who had been with him through countless lifetimes, playing different roles, helping him learn different lessons. One presence stood out. It was brighter than the others, more defined, emanating a deep sense of wisdom and love. His guide, the being who had been with him since the beginning, who watched over him through every incarnation, who helped him plan each life and supported him through each death. The guide moved closer to the table, and the others followed. It was time to begin. The guide's voice came not as sound but as knowing, as thoughts that appeared fully formed in his mind. We're here to plan your next life, your Earth life, the one you'll be living now. And suddenly he understood. This wasn't a past life regression. This was a between-life regression. He was remembering the time before he was born, the time when he was still spirit, still fully aware of who he truly was and what he came to Earth to do. The guide gestured to the table, and the surface came alive. Images swirled and shifted, forming into recognizable shapes. He saw Earth, the blue and green planets spinning in space, and then the view zoomed in, closer and closer, until he could see continents, countries, cities. The guide explained that they needed to choose where he would be born, which country, which culture, which family. Each choice would create different opportunities, different challenges, different lessons. He watched as various options played out on the table's surface. He saw himself being born in Asia, growing up in a tight-knit family, learning discipline and respect for tradition. He saw himself born in Europe, experiencing old-world culture, history layered upon history. He saw himself in South America, Africa, Australia. Each location offered something different. Each one would shape him in unique ways. But then one scene caught his attention. North America, a suburban neighborhood, a middle-class family, 2 parents, an older sibling. Nothing exotic, nothing dramatic, just ordinary. And yet, as he looked at this ordinary scene, he felt a pull. This was the one. The guide seemed pleased, as if this was the choice they had expected him to make. And then came the explanation of why this particular setting mattered. The guide showed him that this life wasn't about grand adventures or extreme experiences. This life was about something more subtle. It was about learning to find meaning in the ordinary, about discovering that enlightenment doesn't require monasteries or mountains, that spiritual growth can happen in traffic jams and office cubicles and grocery store lines. This was a life about bringing light into the everyday world, and for that lesson, an ordinary setting was perfect. Next came the choice of parents. The table's surface shifted again, and he saw them, the man and woman who would become his mother and father. He watched scenes from their lives, their childhoods, their struggles, their dreams. He saw their strengths and their weaknesses. He saw the wounds they carried, the patterns they repeated, the love they had to give and the love they didn't know how to express. And he understood that they were perfect for what he needed to learn. His mother would teach him about emotional depth. She carried pain from her own childhood, pain she never fully processed, and that pain would sometimes spill over onto him. He would feel neglected at times, misunderstood, and that would hurt. But that hurt was part of the plan. It would teach him empathy. It would help him understand suffering. It would give him the experience he needed to help others who felt the same way. His father would teach him about strength and silence. He was a man who worked hard, provided well, but didn't know how to show affection. Didn't know how to say the words his son would long to hear. And the absence of those words would create a hunger in him, a need for validation that would drive him for years. But eventually, he would learn to find that validation within himself, and that lesson would be priceless. The guide showed him other people who would play important roles, his older sibling, who would be both protector and competitor, teaching him about loyalty and rivalry, his first love, who would break his heart and teach him about loss, his best friend, who would stand by him through the darkest times and teach him about true friendship, his future spouse, though he couldn't see details clearly, just a sense of a deep connection, a partnership that would challenge and complete him. But not everyone in his life was there to be positive. The guide showed him people who would hurt him, betray him, disappoint him, a teacher who would shame him in front of the class, a boss who would undervalue his work, a friend who would spread lies about him. And when he felt resistance to these people, when he wanted to say no, I don't want them in my life, the guide gently explained. These people were playing roles. They had agreed, on a soul level, to be the villains in his story, to give him experiences he needed in order to grow. And he had done the same for them, in other lifetimes. This was how souls helped each other learn. Then came the major life events. The guide touched the table, and a timeline appeared. A long, glowing line, stretching from birth to death, with bright points marking significant moments. Some points were marked in gold, indicating positive events. Others were marked in dark blue, indicating challenges. The guide walked him through each one. At age 7, a moment of trauma. He saw himself falling from a tree, breaking his arm. He felt the fear, the pain, and the guide explained that this event would teach him that his body was fragile, that he wasn't invincible. It would make him more careful, more aware of his physical limitations. A small lesson, but an important one. At age 12, the loss of a grandparent. He saw himself at the funeral, not fully understanding death, feeling confused and scared. This would be his first real encounter with mortality. The beginning of questions about what happens after we die. Questions that would eventually lead him to spirituality. At 16, the first heartbreak. A relationship that felt like everything, then ended suddenly, leaving him devastated. He watched himself crying in his room, feeling like the pain would never end. And the guide showed him why this mattered. This experience would break open his heart, would teach him that love involves risk, would prepare him for deeper, more mature relationships later. At 23, a career disappointment, a job he wanted desperately, worked hard for, but didn't get. He saw himself receiving the rejection email, feeling like a failure. And the guide explained that this rejection would redirect him, would force him to consider other paths, would ultimately lead him to the work he was truly meant to do, even though he couldn't see it at the time. At 28, a health crisis. The guide didn't show him details, just a sense of his body breaking down, doctors, tests, fear of death. This would be a major turning point, a wake-up call, a moment when he would be forced to reevaluate everything, to let go of the life he thought he should be living, and start living the life his soul actually wanted. At 35, a spiritual awakening. The guide showed him sitting in meditation, and suddenly the veil lifting, suddenly remembering, suddenly understanding that he was so much more than his body, his thoughts, his story. This moment would change everything. would set him on the path he came here to walk. And then, further down the timeline, events that were hazier, less defined, the guide explained that not everything was set in stone. There were certain key moments that were planned, certain lessons that had to be learned. But there was also free will. There were choices he would make that could change the course of his life. Relationships he might or might not pursue. Careers he might or might not choose. Risks he might or might not take. The timeline showed probabilities, not certainties. He saw 3 possible deaths, 3 different ages where his soul had the option to leave if the lessons were complete. One in his early 50s, from heart disease. One in his mid-60s from cancer. One in his late 70s, from old age. Which one would actually happen depended on choices he hadn't made yet, on how he took care of his body, on whether he completed his soul's mission, on whether he chose to stay or was ready to go home. Looking at all of this, at the whole map of his life laid out before him, he felt overwhelmed. How could he agree to so much pain, so much struggle? Why would he choose a life that included trauma and heartbreak and disappointment and illness? And that's when the guide showed him the other side of the table. The surface shifted, and suddenly he was seeing the same timeline but different. He saw the moments of joy. The first time he rode a bike without training wheels, wind in his hair, feeling free. The night he laughed so hard with friends that his stomach hurt. The morning he woke up next to someone he loved and felt completely at peace. The day his child was born, if he chose to have children. The sunset that took his breath away. The song that moved him to tears. The random act of kindness from a stranger that restored his faith in humanity. He saw the people he would help, the friend he would talk off a ledge, the coworker he would encourage when they wanted to give up, the stranger he would smile at in passing, not knowing they were having the worst day of their life, and that smile would be the one thing that kept them going. The ripple effects of his presence, spreading out in ways he would never fully know or understand. He saw the growth, saw himself as a child, scared and small, then as a teenager, confused and searching, then as a young adult, trying to figure out who he was, and then, gradually, he saw himself becoming more solid, more confident, more aligned with his true self. He saw the wisdom earned through pain, the compassion born from suffering, the strength built from surviving things he thought would destroy him. He saw himself transforming from a human having spiritual experiences to a spiritual being having a human experience, and suddenly it all made sense. The pain wasn't punishment, it was curriculum. The challenges weren't random, they were chosen, carefully selected to help him learn specific lessons, develop specific qualities, prepare him for specific work. Every single event, positive or negative, was part of a larger design, a map drawn by his own soul, with help from his guides and his soul family. A map designed to get him from where he started to where he needed to be. The guide asked if he was ready to agree, ready to take this life, with all its joys and sorrows, all its beauty and pain, ready to forget all of this, to be born into a tiny, helpless body, to spend years not knowing who he really was or why he came, ready to trust that even when it felt like he was lost, he was actually exactly where he needed to be. He looked around the table at the other beings there, his soul family. They radiated love and support. Some of them would be in his life, playing their assigned roles. Others would watch from the other side, sending guidance, arranging synchronicities, helping in ways he wouldn't recognize. They all believed in him. They all knew he could do this, and their certainty gave him certainty. He looked at the guide, and in that moment, he felt something so profound it defied description. He felt loved, completely, unconditionally, eternally loved, not because of anything he had done or would do, not because he was special or chosen, but simply because he existed, because he was part of the great cosmic whole, because his soul was a unique expression of the divine, and that alone made him infinitely valuable. And in that love, he found his answer. Yes, yes, he would take this life. Yes, he would go to Earth. Yes, he would forget and remember and struggle and grow. Yes, he would experience pain because the joy would be worth it. Yes, he would feel lost because finding himself would be the whole point. Yes, he would do this because at the deepest level, beyond logic or reason, this was what his soul wanted. This was his calling, his purpose, his gift to the universe. The moment he agreed, everything changed. The room began to fade. The table, the beings, the guide, all of it started to dissolve like smoke. He felt himself being pulled away, pulled down, pulled toward earth and toward birth. He tried to hold on to the memory, tried to keep the vision of the plan, but it was slipping away, and he heard the guide's final words, clear and strong. You won't remember this, but we will be with you, always. And when the time is right, you will remember. Trust the process. Trust the map. Trust yourself. And then he was falling. Through layers of consciousness, through dimensions, through the veil between spirit and matter. He felt himself getting smaller, more confined. He felt the limitations of form closing in around him. And then there was pressure, darkness, the sound of a heartbeat that wasn't his own. He was in the womb, waiting, growing, preparing for the moment when he would take his first breath and begin the journey he had so carefully planned. He opened his eyes. He was back in the therapist's office, back in his adult body, back in present time. But he was not the same person who had closed his eyes an hour ago. Something fundamental had shifted. He had seen the map. He had remembered the planning table. And even though the details were already starting to fade, even though he couldn't recall every specific event or lesson, the core truth remained. His life was not random. His struggles were not meaningless. His pain had purpose. Everything, absolutely everything, was part of a plan he had helped create. Tears rolled down his face, but they weren't sad tears. They were tears of relief, of understanding, of gratitude. All those years he had spent feeling like a victim, like life was happening to him, like he was just unlucky, or cursed, or broken. All of it was wrong. He wasn't a victim. He was a volunteer. He chose this, and he chose it from a place of wisdom and love and clear understanding of what it would cost and what it would give. The therapist sat quietly, letting him process. She had seen this before. People who went to the planning table often came back transformed. Because there's something about seeing your own life from the soul's perspective that changes everything. All the petty worries, the ego concerns, the surface-level problems, they suddenly seem so small, so temporary. When you know that your soul chose your parents, chose your challenges, chose even your greatest pain because it knew that pain would help you grow, you can't see yourself or your life the same way ever again. In the days that followed, he thought constantly about what he had seen. He looked at his mother with new eyes, understanding that her emotional distance wasn't a failure on her part, or his. It was part of the agreement, part of what he needed to experience in order to learn compassion. He looked at his father and felt gratitude instead of resentment for all those unspoken words, because that silence had pushed him to find his own voice. He thought about the heartbreaks, the rejections, the failures, and he saw them differently now, not as proof that he wasn't good enough, but as redirections, course corrections, doors closing so other doors could open. Each disappointment had led him somewhere he needed to go, taught him something he needed to know. He even looked at his current struggles with new understanding. The health issues he'd been dealing with, the financial stress, the relationship problems. These weren't signs that he was doing life wrong. They were part of the plan, part of the wake-up call, part of what would push him to finally step into his true purpose instead of playing it safe. And that was perhaps the most powerful shift. Before the regression, he had been waiting for things to get easier, waiting for permission, waiting for some external sign that it was okay to be who he really was and do what he really came here to do. But after seeing the planning table, after remembering that he chose this life with full knowledge of what it would entail, the waiting was over. If his soul had that much faith in him, if his guides believed he could handle what was coming, then who was he to doubt? Who was he to play small or hide or pretend he was less than he was? He started making changes. Small at first, he quit the job that was sucking his soul dry, even though he didn't have another one lined up. He had a conversation with his parents that he'd been avoiding for years, saying things that needed to be said. He ended a relationship that was comfortable, but not authentic. He started creating, writing, sharing his truth, even though his voice shook and his hands trembled. Because he knew now that the fear was part of it. The vulnerability was part of it. The risk was part of it. That's what made it real. And as he stepped more fully into alignment with his soul's plan, life responded, not by getting easier, but by getting more meaningful. Synchronicities increased. The right people appeared at the right time. Opportunities opened that he never could have forced or manufactured. It was like the universe had been waiting for him to remember, and now that he was finally walking the path he came here to walk, everything was conspiring to support him. He also started noticing that he wasn't alone. There were others who had the same look in their eyes, the same sense of waking up, the same feeling of remembering something important. And when he talked to these people, really talked to them, he often discovered they had similar stories. They too had felt lost. They too had struggled to understand why life was so hard. And many of them had also had experiences, through regression or meditation or spontaneous awakening, where they glimpsed the bigger picture, where they remembered, if only for a moment, that they chose this, that there was a plan, that it all meant something. He thought about the guide's final words: trust the process, trust the map, trust yourself. And he realized that trusting wasn't about blind faith. It was about remembering that before he came here, when he could see the whole timeline, when he knew exactly what he was signing up for, he had said yes without hesitation. That version of himself, the soul self, had complete confidence that he could handle this life. And if that version of himself believed in him, then maybe, just maybe, it was time to believe in himself too. Months turned into years. The memory of the regression session faded into the background of daily life, as memories do. But the impact remained. He carried it with him, a quiet certainty beneath all the noise and chaos of human existence. When things got hard, and they still did, he would pause and remember. Remember the table. Remember the map. Remember that this too was part of the plan, and somehow, that made even the hardest moments bearable. He also developed a new relationship with death. Before the regression, death had been his greatest fear, the ultimate unknown, the end of everything. But after seeing the planning table, after understanding that birth and death were just doorways, transitions between states of being, the fear loosened its grip. He understood now that when this life ended, he would return to that room, would sit at that table again, would review everything that happened, every choice made, every lesson learned, would see his guides again, his soul family, would feel that indescribable love again, and would probably start planning the next life. That thought made him smile. The idea that he would do this again, choose another body, another family, another set of challenges, it seemed crazy when he thought about it with his human mind. But from the soul's perspective, it made perfect sense, because each life was an opportunity, a chance to experience, to learn, to grow, a chance to know yourself through contrast and challenge, a chance to love, to serve, to create. And what soul wouldn't want that? What soul wouldn't sign up for the adventure of physical existence, despite all its pain, because the rewards were so much greater than anything the human mind could comprehend? He wished he could tell everyone what he had seen, wished he could shake people awake and show them the truth, that their lives weren't random, that their pain had purpose, that they chose this, planned this, agreed to this, from a place of wisdom beyond anything their current selves could access. But he knew it didn't work that way. Everyone had their own timing, their own wake-up call, their own moment when the veil would lift and they would remember. All he could do was live his truth, share his story, be an example of what it looked like to trust the map, and hope that maybe, for someone out there who was ready to hear it, his words would be the catalyst that helped them remember too. Because that was the whole point, wasn't it? All of it. The planning table, the carefully chosen challenges, the pain that cracked you open, the joy that put you back together, the whole messy, beautiful, heartbreaking, magnificent experience of being human. It was all designed to help you remember what you forgot when you were born, that you are so much more than this body, this personality, this story. You are an eternal soul on a journey through time and space. You are a spark of the divine having an adventure in physical form. You are loved beyond measure. You are never alone. And you drew the map. If this story stirred something in you that feels like remembering, subscribe for more journeys beyond the veil.